to drop in. So I'll start to see. Oh yeah, we've got some attendees coming. It's always good to see. So we'll just wait a minute while everyone drops in. Oh, Fienne's here. So from Singapore. So she's just logged on. So just wait for everyone to drop in and then we'll get going. Right, a few more. So it's funny how it takes time for everyone to come into the session. The computer has to cope. Right, looking good. But it's very sunny here actually. We've got loads of snow. And
Oh, have you got snow?
Oh yeah, yeah. And it's so bright as a result. Everything's reflected.
Yeah.
You probably
So
see
where are you geographically?
Northampton.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You're in Arundel, aren't you?
Yes, just outside on the
Oh, it's lovely. They're beautiful place.
But we haven't got snow yet. My wife is very disappointed because we get things from the children showing snowy scenes, and we haven't got any yet.
Oh, that's.
And it would be a perfect time to have it because you can't go anywhere or do anything anyway. So, you know, let's have some snow.
Just send your wife to me. She's a great cook, apparently. And
yeah, I know. No, I'm very, very spoiled. I am.
Right. I think we've got a fairly steady number now, so I think we'll get going.
Okay.
Right, so hello and welcome everyone. I'm Rebecca Harding and I'm chairman of the Society of Women Writers and Journalists. This is another in our up close and personal series of interviews. And it's great to have you all joining us. Today, I'm thrilled to be talking to Simon Brett, who we're also lucky enough to have as a patron of the Society. Simon studied English at Oxford and then joined BBC Radio and London Weekend Television. While with the BBC, Simon produced a variety of programmes, including I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue and Just a Minute. Simon went on to become a full-time writer and wrote a number of radio and television scripts, including After Henry and Smelling of Roses. He has written 4 separate series of detective novels. His Charles Paris books have been adapted for Radio 4 with Bill Nighy playing Charles. He has also written several mystery plays and some other novels, of which A Shock to the System was made into a film starring Michael Caine. His 110th book, Lotto, Twinks and the Maharaja's Jewel, which I think is an absolutely awesome title, and I told him that the other day, was published last week, which is very exciting. So yeah, slightly prolific there on the book front. He received an OBE in 2016 for his services to literature, which I think was very well deserved. So we'll have a question and answer session at the end. And if you have questions for Simon, there's a Q&A button at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So please post your questions there. So Simon, welcome. How are you?
I'm absolutely fine, and very nice to see you, Rebecca. And I had the good news yesterday that I have my first jab on Wednesday, so I'm very excited about that. Oh, yes.
It's just so young at 35 to need a jab.
Yes, well, yeah, no, one of the few advantages of my advanced age is that I'm ahead of the queue. Yeah.
Well, that's very good to hear. So I wanted to talk to you about your writing as well as your TV production and sort of find out how it all came together for you through your career. So was writing something you grew up with, and when did you start?
I think I always liked the idea of writing, and I did. I remember a lot of writers say there was a charismatic English teacher at some point in their life, and at my boys' prep school, there was a teacher called Mr. Evans, and he used to set us these wonderfully inventive homeworks. Particularly, we had to sort of give us a list of words every week, and we had to sort of learn how to spell them and define them. And they were quite complicated words for 7-year-olds. I remember one week we had the word impeccable, and a friend of mine spelt it perfectly, but his definition of it was impervious to other birds. Which was not, I think, but he actually, Mr. Evans, set us this wonderful homework of writing our own epitaphs. And we were 7. And I remember, and it's going to be a difficult death to engineer, but what I wrote was, here I lie, S. Brett by name, killed by a lion I thought was tame. And sort of from that time on, everything I've written has had jokes in it, one way or the other.
It's all Mr. Evans's fault.
Oh, well, yes. No, I'm very grateful to him because he did kindle an interest in language, which I think is what keeps me going. And also, my mother was a great reader and encouraged me to read. And I think, I mean, to be a writer, there are only two things, you know, there are lots of courses and that kind of thing, but basically the only way you can learn is by reading and writing. So the more you read, the more, and sort of think, why do I like that? Why don't I like that? You know, that sort of forming a, and what I loved about, because I went to university to read history, and what spirited me about history was that you never got near to the kind of source material. You know, you're always at a distance and reading somebody else's views. Whereas with, and I changed to English, and with English, you know, you read something and you think, I like that, you know, and you don't have to rationalize why. And then, okay, you read critics and things and you see that that was the skill and they were using this kind of device and that kind of thing. But it was your gut reaction that happened first. And I mean, just when we were talking earlier about books, you know, there is no greater recommendation for a book than somebody else saying, oh, I read this wonderful book about, you know, and okay, you read it, maybe you don't agree, but it's that, you know, I think so much enthusiasm can be generated about literature, and there's so much of it, you know. I'm, I don't know how many more books I've got left to read, but I'm trying to speed up because there's so much good stuff out there.
I know, you just panic, don't you? You think, how many years have I got left?
Well, I had this great moment in 1981, actually, where up until that point, if I started a book, you know, it was the Magnus Magnuson principle, I've started, so I'll finish. And I would finish any book I started. And then, as I was climbing the north face of a very highly praised literary novel in 1981, I got out my calculator and I sort of worked out, given an actuarial life expectancy, how many books I was likely to read. And it was a very pathetically small number. So with a cry of life is too short for Midnight's Children, I hurled it across the room. And from that day on, if they don't engage me in the first 50 pages, then I'm afraid, you know, they're not succeeding. I'll give them 50 pages, but I mean, having said that, there are very few books that I don't press on and finish, but there are a few.
Yeah, so you've got a little pile by the wall now where you throw them. Superb. I love the fact you worked that out. That's just great. So, I mean, after university, you went on to the BBC, and you're working for London Weekend Television as well. So, what appealed to you about TV? And
yes, I should actually say that I did have one other job, which is so unusual that I will mention it. But when I finished at university, and I directed a late night review on the fringe of the Edinburgh Festival. And I went back home to my parents, and they were very good about it. You know, that was sort of September, and it was well into October before they said, have you thought about getting a job at all at any level? And I said, well, I've got some feelers out at the BBC, but I'll tell you what, I'll go to what was then called the Labour Exchange and see if I can get something temporary. And so I went to the Labour Exchange and sat opposite this very daunting lady who said, have you got any qualifications? And I said, well, I've got a first-class honours degree in English from Oxford University. And she went, not much call for that round here. She said, I'll tell you what, the local department store, Shinners of Sutton, are looking for extra staff over the Christmas period. And in fact, she said, I think they're looking for a Father Christmas. And I still have at home this little green card which says, this introduces to Mr. S.A.L. Brett for the advertised vacancy of Father Christmas. And I went from the Labour Exchange up Sutton High Street to Shinners of Sutton, the local department store. And I met the buyer in the toy department. And I did a couple of exploratory ho-ho-hos. And at the age of 22, I was master of my own grotto. So, I mean, that was my first job. But sorry, we'll go on the radio and television stuff. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I always loved acting and writing. And at university, I was at Oxford and did a lot of acting. And, you know, I was president of the Dramatic Society and that kind of thing. And sort of that thing of review, you know, writing and performing, writing comedy sketches and being in them, and that was lovely. So I did the Edinburgh Festival 2 years, And at that stage, I mean, there wasn't a great comedy industry as there is now. And so particularly BBC Radio, they would go to Oxford and Cambridge. I'm afraid it sounds terribly elitist, but those were the places that had a tradition of, you know, footlights in Cambridge, and it changed its name. But when I was doing it, it was called the Etceteras in Oxford. And so a lot of, you know, young producers, I mean, John Cleese even at one stage was a BBC radio producer, and Griff Rhys-Jones and John Lloyd and David Hatch and all kinds of, so there was a kind of natural progression. And I had a wonderful time, really. You know, I was like 22 and I was producing these radio programs, live radio programs and that sort of thing. And I remember, I'm totally unmusical, but I did produce a music session with Vera Lynn. I mean, and then as you said, I'm sorry I haven't a clue. I was in when they were starting that, and Just a Minute as well. I produced that for some time. And I just met some amazing people, and I remember because with Just a Minute, it was the dream team back then of Nicholas Parsons inevitably in the chair, and it was Clement Freud and Derek Nimmo, Kenneth Williams, and Peter Jones.
Oh wow!
And I mean, you know, I was in my early 20s producing these people.
With those guys.
I remember one day. I mean, I was very fond of Kenneth Williams, but he was quite. You know, you didn't relax exactly in his presence. And I remember one day he came into the studio and he was very, you know, most upset. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, I went into the bank. And this was before cards and things, you know, you had to have an arrangement, I think it was called, with the bank to cash a check. And he said, this chit of a girl behind the counter, she said, yeah, you're not Kenneth Williams, aren't you? And he said, that isn't really important, I'm here on business. No, tell me, you are, aren't you? You're Kenneth Williams. And he said, well, look, I'm here. She said, go and tell me you are, aren't you? You're Kenneth Williams. And he said, well, yes, right, I am Kenneth Williams. Now, please, will you cash this check for me? And she said, oh, no, not without identification. So, I mean, there was this wonderful thing that whoever came in, you know, they'd always got a new joke. I remember working with comedian Alfred Marks, and he once came in and he said, I won't say my wife's jealous, but she's the only woman I know. Which was a joke I quite liked. And I kind of, so I mean, it was a fascinating time. And it also, I mean, I think it taught me a lot as a writer because, you know, well, radio, obviously, you're dealing with dialogue, and I like writing dialogue. And I'd much rather define a character by something they say, or, you know, people give away. And people often say the kind of opposite of, I mean, when I was a television producer, I worked with one particular actress who kept starting every sentence with, look, you know, I'm the last person to be starry about these kind of things. But her dressing room is bigger than mine. I measured it. You know, so you hear so much. And so, I mean, in my books now, you know, there's lots of dialogue because I just love writing dialogue. And it's amazing how you can, you know, you hear a line and there's some, I mean, presumably as a writer, we're all trying to project and sort of say, how would that character feel in that situation? But there's some lines which people tell you and you hear. And you don't, I mean, I remember quite recently, I was on the seafront at Littlehampton and there was a woman talking to her dog. And she said, are you looking forward to your MRI scan? And I thought, kind of, where does that come from? How did someone go through? I mean, I just thought that was wonderful. And there's some lines that, and I remember a friend of mine told me this line that she had heard. She used to work in a factory, and she said the women at the adjacent table were discussing their husbands, and she heard one of them saying to the other, oh, I can always tell when my husband wants a bit because he leaves his teeth in after supper. And I just thought, I mean, you could never make up a line like that. You have to actually to hear it. And so you remember these things, and I'd never used that line, but you know, I usually have a notebook with me and scribble down these little things you hear, and I know when I started as a writer, I used to think as soon as I started anything, I had to immediately start writing it. I'm much cannier now that I recognise something that has potential. And I'll say, yeah, but I don't know what to do with it yet. And there are lots of little lines that I've got scribbled down, which probably will never see the light of day. But, you know, you do get better at recognising something that has potential, shall we say.
So when you were sort of producing things like Just a Minute and so on, and the sort of comedy shows, were you starting to write, were you writing sketches for them as well, or jokes and things? Or?
A bit. I mean, I contributed, was the sort of comedy program that preceded I'm Sorry, I Haven't a Clue. And I started a program called Weekending, which ran for years and years, which is kind of topical comedy. And I wrote little sketches for that. And meanwhile, I was trying to write novels as well. And if there are any aspiring novelists by any chance listening to us at this moment, I would say that I wrote 4 before I had one accepted. And since, as you said, the last one was the 110th, I've sort of caught up a bit. You know, I mean, I think I managed when I was about 17, I managed to write 60,000 words. And the next and bigger stage was to write 60,000 words that might interest someone else. That took quite a long time. But I mean, I'm very fortunate, you know, I make a living from doing something that I would do anyway. And when it's going well, I absolutely love it, which I'm sure fellow writers will agree with. And when it's going badly, it's sheer purgatory because there's no one else to blame. You know, most jobs you have a boss or, you know, somebody you're dealing with who can blame a bit. But if you're a writer, well, I suppose you can blame your publisher or your agent, but that's a bit unfair, really. It's your fault. You know, if it's rubbish, it's down to you.
To go writing full time? Why did you give up the producing and move into the
I think I'd always nursed the sort of image, you know, I thought being a writer would be a lovely life, but I didn't think it was realistic. And then I got to the point where I did have a book accepted, book number 5, I think, and that was the first of my Charles Paris murder mysteries. And then I changed jobs from being in radio, BBC radio, to London Weekend Television as a producer. And I thought maybe the change of medium would excite me. In fact, I didn't really enjoy being a television producer. It was very slow, I thought, after radio. And also the writing was starting to, and I got to the point where I was making as much money from my spare time activity of writing as I was from the day job. But by then I was married and we've got 2 small children, and I just wasn't really seeing the kids because I would, you know, I'd spend the day in the studio or whatever, and then I'd come home and have something to eat and go upstairs to my study. And I thought something had to give. So I thought it was time to halve my income and become a full-time writer. And I remember that first year of being a full-time writer, I was like walking around the house with kind of springs on my heels. I couldn't believe how lovely it was. And also, you know, being with the kids when they were little, which was, you know, the reverse of most male careers. And so I got all the empty nest syndrome and things, you know, when the youngest started going to school in the afternoon. But that was when we used to go for our walk by the river. And so, you know, and then, of course, in the second year, everything, all the things I thought I'd got set up, kind of, they all fell through, and suddenly I was worried about money and, you know, paranoid. And so, I mean, it's always a roller coaster, but I don't think many people who are listening who are writers would disagree with that. You know, it's a strange existence, but very rewarding when it works, as I say. Yes.
Absolutely. So doing your scripts, you know, because you've done a lot of scripts there. As well. Did you find that having done the producing actually helped you improve the quality of the scripts you were writing?
I think it did, because when I ceased to be a producer, I think I was a pretty good script editor, because, you know, I'd done enough, particularly comedy, to see where things were getting too slow, or, you know, we need a joke in there, that kind of thing. Mind you, of course, when I started working on my own stuff, you know, I had to kind of relearn completely, because although I was very good on other people's scripts, I had to sort of stand back and say what's not working here and why, that kind of thing. And then I got into sort of writing sitcoms, really, originally. I mean, I was doing the crime novels and so I mean, something like After Henry, when I started that on radio. And I just, you know, I've written a lot of stuff for, we can't say actresses now, but actors who are female. Can we say female? Oh, I don't know, J.K. Rowling situation. Right. Anyway, I've been very fortunate, really, with the people I've worked with, because After Henry, I had Prunella Scales and Joan Sanderson playing the main characters, and then I wrote another series called No Commitments, and had Rosemary Leach and Angela Thorne and Celia Imrie. So, I mean, you know, I've been very, and the interesting thing is that I find I never like writing a script with someone in mind, you know, because the character of the actor sort of inhibits you in a way. You think, oh, they wouldn't like that, you know, they wouldn't say that line there. So I'd rather write something, you know, with just getting the characters, getting the relationship between the characters. But then once it's been cast, you know, they're kind of contributing, because you know how they'll say the lines, and you notice something that an actor or actress does particularly well, and you think, oh, let's write more of that, you know, let's put more of that in. And so you do actually, people look at you strangely if you say you hear voices, but when you're writing for actors, you do hear voices, and you can sort of say, oh, I know. And what happens with, if you're writing, I mean, After Henry, I think I wrote nearly 40 scripts overall, with the radio and television, because it went on to television. And you know the characters so well that what gets difficult when you start, it's getting the characters right, and the further you go on, it's getting the situations, because you've done so many of the obvious ones, and so it takes much longer to find the plot. Once you've got the plot, it virtually writes itself, because you know the characters so well. And I remember when I when it went from radio to television After Henry, we'd done it on radio without a studio audience, and I much preferred that, because you write natural speech rhythms. But in those days in television, there hadn't been many successful non-audience sitcoms, so The Office hadn't happened, and you know, lots of stuff now, it's a rarity really to have a studio audience. Then it wasn't, and I argued and argued with the producer, Jimmy Gilbert, who was doing the television version. And eventually he said to me, and this will either amuse you or not, depending on where you're born, but he said, Simon, it's all right for us down here, but you have to remember that north of Watford, if they don't hear people laughing, they don't know it's funny. Fortunately, I think things have changed a bit in that respect.
North of Watford, yeah.
Watford. Yeah.
That's hilarious. So it's so interesting that you know what you're saying about script writing, because I actually did a comedy script writing course this weekend to see how
a whole weekend. So you know everything. Sorry, you tell me how to do it. Go on.
Something. All I learned was that it's actually a really, really difficult thing to do. And looking at how you put it together and the sort of different aspects, it's completely different to novels and really interesting.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I think it's kind of closer to poetry almost than anything, in terms of, you know, the exactness of the language and the order of the words and that kind of thing. Because when I went from radio to television, you know, you had to put places for the audience to laugh, which meant that often you had to change the word order so that the funny word comes at the end of the line, that kind of thing. It is, I mean, it's quite a technical exercise. I mean, it's lovely when it writes itself, and it does. I think with a lot of writing, You know, a lot of people got into writing because at some stage of their life they wrote something that wrote itself, and that just felt so wonderful. They spend the rest of their professional life trying to recapture that moment. So you sort of, you know, you build up technique so that even when it's not brilliant, you can get on and do something. There's a lovely quote from an American humorous novelist called Peter de Vries. And he was asked, you know, can you only write when you're inspired, which is one of those questions that people get asked. And he said, yes, I can only write when I'm inspired. And I see to it that I'm inspired at 9 o'clock every morning, which I thought was very good answer.
And that is the reality of a life as
Absolutely,
a writer.
yeah,
You can't say, I don't feel like it today.
No, no.
My muse is not working for me.
No.
So you prefer writing for radio then rather than TV? So.
I prefer, yes, I think so. I mean, of course, one has to also take into account that television pays a lot more. So, you know, you can't be too fretful about it. So, I mean, after Henry put my children through private school, so I'm not, I'm not knocking it at any level.
We like Henry.
Oh, there's the phone. Don't worry. Somebody alive. No, I don't think my wife's here, so it'll just ring for a bit. Oh, stop. That's all right. Yes, sorry, go on.
And where do you start? What's your process?
Well, with a script or a book?
Yeah, I just want to check the course was right this weekend as
Ah,
well.
well, I start absolutely with character everywhere. If you're writing fiction, you've got, you know, the characters have got to be very firm. And if you're writing a series, the relationship between the characters has to be very good and very believable, because then, you know, whatever situation you put them in, you kind of know how they'll react and how they'll rub each other up the wrong way and that kind of thing. And a lot of comedy is sort of in expectation.
Yeah.
You know, and soap operas too. I mean, it's, you know, two people talking about a third saying, oh, she won't like it when she hears about whatever, you know, so that because we know the character, we, the audience, think, no, she won't like it. And then you get the moment when she does find out about, and how does she react to that? And maybe she, you know, she confuses your expectations by actually reacting in a, I mean, it's that kind of stuff all the way. And really, I mean, writing sitcoms, it's a strange sort of thing, because somebody once said that a sitcom has a bunch of people who start off together and then say they want to do something entirely different for a whole episode and end up back together. You know, it's a strange kind of mix. I mean, sitcoms have changed quite a lot over the years, but there still are, I think, that character continuity. And again, with a novel, you know, particularly a crime novel, I mean, you have to have a character, not necessarily your investigator, but someone in the book who people can identify with enough to sort of think, to actually care what happens next. So I think, so I would always, with crime novels, it's different, because character, yes, but once I got that, the next thing is setting, you know, because, I mean, say the Charles Paris books, which all have a theatrical context, I have to think, you know, what is the setting going to be? So what area of show business could he get involved in? And once you've done that, you get a lot of the characters too, because, you know, say he's in an open air Shakespeare or something like that. Well, where is the venue? That's the setting, but also there's going to be a director, there's probably going to be a producer, there are going to be other actors playing the other parts, there are going to be stage managers. You know, the cast list sort of fills up once you've made that basic decision. And also, you know, you find out, I mean, I like picking people's brains about, because, you know, having spent over 40 years of my life sitting in front of a screen, I don't know much about the real world. And I mean the very basic real world, you know, what people do in offices these days. I mean, I don't spend much time in offices. So to actually, you know, to go and, if I haven't done it myself, and decreasingly have I done it myself because I've spent all my time behind a keyboard, I would take out for lunch someone who has done it and just get them to do the terribly basic stuff. I mean, I remember when I wrote a book in my feathering series called Death Under the Dryer, which you would not be surprised to hear was set in a hairdressing salon. And I needed some basic research, so I took out for lunch Margaret, the lady who ran the salon I then frequented, and my lovely stylist, Diva, who is still cutting my hair, and God, I wish I could go and see her now. But and just ask these terribly basic things. You know, what's the first thing you do when you go on? Do you switch on some music? Do you switch on the coffee? Do you sweep up the hair? No, that was done the night before. And they just told me some fascinating things, like, you know, who were the most difficult clients. Asian men, apparently, very, you know, are very, very full of themselves and how their hair is cut. And they also told me this thing that apparently a lot of people think that they're left-handed because they always see them in the mirror. I never have thought of that. You know, that kind of, so you're just taking someone through, and if you take them out for lunch or something, they're kind of relaxed. And because most of us, you know, what we do is kind of quite dull. I mean, to ourselves, but to somebody who knows nothing about it, you know, you get these wonderful little details. I remember when I was doing one of the Charles Paris's, which was set around a television game show. It was called Dead Giveaway, would you believe? And a friend of mine, I was still in BBC, but her secretary had just moved from radio to television to work on the Generation game. First time round, Bruce Forsyth with his own hair. I mean, it's a long time ago. And I just asked her, you know, how the researchers worked and how people became contestants, and there was no email and stuff back then, and she said they'd write in letters to say they ought to be on it, and then they'd be sent a form to fill in all this hilarious stuff about, you know, funny things that happened on their honeymoon so that Brucey could have a little giggle. And they also at that stage had to send in a Polaroid, as they then were, photograph of themselves, you see. And television then, and possibly now, was based on the fallacy that everyone is attractive. And she said that the researchers had in their office what they called the ugly wall. And on the ugly wall, they stuck all the Polaroids of the people who they thought were physically disqualified from being in. And I thought that was so cruel and so absolutely typical of the values of television that, you know, I put it straight in the book. I mean, things like that, you know, you can never make that up. As I say, you project and you think, what would it feel like if, and, you know, what would this character say in this? But there are some gifts like that that you actually have to get from someone who has lived it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But what was the appeal of the detective novels rather than any other type? Why did you go down that avenue?
What, crime?
Yeah, crime, I mean, yeah.
I suppose, well, in fact, it was through my radio experience, because I produced a series of adaptations of the Dorothy L. Sayers, Lord Peter Wimsey stories with Ian Carmichael, who just played the part on television, and they wanted to do radio versions. And obviously we couldn't just adapt the television scripts, we needed new adaptations. And I worked very closely with a writer called Chris Miller, who's a great friend, and he was doing the adaptations. And that made me less frightened of crime fiction. You know, up till then, I thought you had to have a kind of computerized brain that worked out the plots. But in fact, reading those books and taking them apart, we found that, yes, the plot was important, but character and dialogue were at least as important. And I kind of thought to myself, well, I don't know whether I can do plots. And there are still newspaper critics of this opinion. But I think I can do character and dialogue. And so that's what got me into writing the first Charles Paris. And in fact, I find writing crime and writing comedy, I think in terms of technique, are very similar. Because if you think a lot of jokes, you set something up, it's all pointing in one direction. And the reason it's funny is that it veers off at the end into another direction. And it's exactly that with a crime novel. You know, a lot of the sort of just interviews, you know, policeman with suspect, detective with suspect, whatever, it all seems to be pointing in one direction. And just at the end, there's the little detail that sends you off in another direction. And also setting up, you know, any kind of writing, I think, the scene setting is the exposition is the most difficult bit. and to do that subtly. And you have to, you know, in both comedy and crime, you have to do that in such a way that it's kind of hidden, that the people have the information. And I remember my sister once came bouncing up to me and she said, "Oh, I just heard this wonderful joke about about the lunch pack of Notre Dame." And I said, "Oh, well, what is?" She said, "You're going to love this. What is wrapped in cellophane and swings from a steeple?" I said, "I have no idea." She said, "Well, it's the lunch pack of Notre Dame." And that is a very good example of the wrong way of telling a joke. Or, you see, I think all writing is, it's feeding information, it's controlling the flow of information and seeing that people have. So, I mean, when I finish one of my crime novels, my wife is probably, well, always the first person to read it. And normally I'm sort of totally knackered and have dived into a vat of whiskey. And probably the first chance she gets to read it is, you know, in bed. So she's there with all these sheets all over the place, and this figure who looms over her shoulder from time to time, breathing whiskey fumes and saying, "Who do you think did it now?" Because you know,
You're on her then, no pressure at all. You do like it, don't you? You like it.
I mean, fortunately, she does like crime fiction. You know, it is a genre that she does like. But I mean, I'm sure a lot of people know that the being the partner of a writer is not always an easy job, because, you know, somebody who's just finished something like a book tends to be fairly knackered and not very coherent, possibly. And, you know, also the partner has probably seen them through. I mean, my wife always says she could tell from the glaze in my eyes when I'm very near the end of finishing a book. And, you know, she would tell me things. She says, "I told you that last week." She said, "Oh, you weren't really here last week, were you?" No. And I was so caught up in the book that I wasn't very coherent. So that is just the way it happens, I think. But I mean, you know, if the spouse, partner, whoever, you know, they read the book and say, "I think it's wonderful," you know, the cynical writer says, "Sycophant." And then, you know, if they say, "I thought it was very good, but I wondered if this," oh, a complete disaster, you know, I'm going to have to scrap the whole thing. It's very...
I know that.
I mean, I think whoever writes anything, and I'm sure the audience we're speaking to today knows all about it. It's an investment of your energy and your emotions and I have huge admiration for anyone who finishes a book, you know, regardless of quality, just sticking with it and getting to the end. And if it's good too, then that's a bonus.
Yeah.
But it does, you know, it's a big commitment. I speak as someone who's about to start another book next week, so yes. Mm.
Do you go about plotting, and do you plan everything in a novel?
No, I mean, it's strange because you've got to. I mean, as I said, with a crime novel, often the setting will give you a lot of the characters, and then if you've done a bit of research, you'll be sort of getting the shape. And it's that difficulty if you want to know enough about the thing but not too much, because and this is, I mean, when for some media you have to write from synopsis, you know, particularly television or something, you'll have to write completely detailed synopsis to get the job. And in my experience, that is I find that it's not nearly as much fun, because I'm one of those writers who I enjoy the first draft, the telling myself the story. That's the bit I like. Whereas others, the first draft is hell, and what they really enjoy is then, you know, shaping it round. For them, the first draft is this lump of marble that they're going to carve into Michelangelo's David, you know. But I like telling myself the story. So if I've done a detailed synopsis, I find the actual writing rather dull, because and the best bits of writing, I think, are where you think you know where it's going, and suddenly you get another idea and you think, "Oh my God, you know, this character who just brought in the cup of coffee, suppose I made her do that and she became," you know, and suddenly the whole thing's been turned inside out and you're writing by the seat of your pants. And it's scary, but that's the most exhilarating bit. So, I mean, I'm often surprised, you know, I've been doing it not enough, but, you know, I'll have a kind of plan. and I'll think, well, that chapter is going to be a really big chapter because everything's coming together there, you know. That's, and when you get to it, it's a very short chapter because, in fact, the build-up is all. So, although I've got the plan, the actual writing is organic, and things change, and things that you thought were going to be big scenes become small scenes, and characters who you thought were going to be irrelevant suddenly become very pivotal, that kind of thing. And that is exciting. I mean, I like that bit.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, how do you plan your characters? Where do they come from? Do you start with characters, or do you start with the setting, or do you start with the how somebody's going to die? Where?
Well, I mean, a lot of crime writing in particular, and also sitcom writing, which I've done, the characters go through from episode to episode. So with that, you know, writers talk about the terrifying blank sheet of paper or the blank screen. But if you're writing a series, you have a start. I mean, it's like going to a party where you know 2 or 3 people who will introduce you to other people. So you've got these characters, and hopefully, if you've chosen your characters or developed your characters right, there will be a conflict between them anyway. So you know that, you know, A is going to react one way to this, B is going, I mean, in the Feathering series, I've got these 2 women in their 50s, and, you know, they're kind of polar opposites in a way. And you kind of know, I know, and the reader knows that, you know, certain things are going to make one of them very happy and the other very unhappy, let us say. So that, then the setting, as I say, you get a lot of characters from that in the background. Then the plot kind of, I mean, I find it works out that I'll get the beginning of it quite clear to myself, and I'll get a bit about 2/3 of the way through quite clear, which tends to be when a lot of the characters who were in at the beginning come back together for some kind of situation. And then obviously the denouement is, I mean, I write traditional whodunits, which not many people are doing that now. But so the whodunit element is, that's the secret that is kept till the end. And then there are, you know, and you have to, and quite often I'll look at and I'll think, we haven't had enough, you know, and I'll just put at the end of the chapter in the plan, I will put suspicion to George. And all it needs is, you know, a couple of sentences. And you may never pick it up again. It's a complete cheat with your readers, but it does kind of work because, you know, it just keeps the thing on the boil. And then hopefully you work out, it's quite difficult to go far into a crime novel without knowing who done it, because it does, you know, it has an effect on everything else. And I always find, well, with anything I write, but particularly crime novels, that the first chapter is the one that gets changed most, because as other details emerge, you know, that has to be set up earlier. So you go back, whereas towards the end of a book, you know, this is my wife talking about the glazed eyes. Towards the end of a book, I know exactly what's going to happen. And it's just a kind of race between my energy and getting the words down on the page. And there is no bigger difference in the world than that between being a paragraph away from the end of a book and having written the last paragraph. You know you're going to have to go back and fiddle around with it. But it's, so mine is just a, you know, it's a speeding up process. And there are some days, I remember, fortunately, I mean, I don't dignify it with the writer's block, but there are times where you're just, you know, you're just stuck. I mean, in my experience, that either means that I'm knackered, you know, I've been doing too much, or that I haven't actually worked out what the next bit is. And I mean, you know, some writers that can last for weeks and months, which is awful. I mean, I have, you know, 2 or 3 days where I'm completely stuck. And I remember one afternoon last year, I mean, quite recently, just sitting, looking at the words chapter 23.
Not getting
for an entire afternoon, and I knew what was going to happen in chapter 24, and obviously I got up to chapter 22, that was all in place, and I just had somehow to bridge this, so
this chapter.
But I think we've all had that. We've all had that. You know, it goes with the territory.
It's link, isn't it? It's those link bits sometimes.
Yeah.
You said you heard voices when you're doing the radio things, and do you see it, the books play out in your head? So, because when I write, I actually see the things.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly hear the voices, and in fact, I mean, since, well, for quite a long time now, I've been recording the audios of my books. So I now write. I always did write really to be read, but now I do that increasingly. And so I'll read things out to myself, and you hear that strange thing of little words that don't look as if they sound the same, but the sounds chime in an uncomfortable way, so you change that. And also, because I know I'm going to read it, it's very striking that in my books there are no Geordies, no one from Northern Ireland, no Brummies, because I can't do the voices, so they're completely excluded. Which is yeah, and in fact I've got one coming up, which, I mean, there's no recording happening at the moment because of the lockdown, but I've got one where I wrote in all these sort of strange bits of Indian philosophy for comic effect. But I've got to, it strikes me before I do the audio, I'll have to find out how to pronounce all these things. So you do write yourself it. And I remember once one of the books that I'd written long before I knew I'd be recording it myself. And I found this really unhelpful thing where it was a long speech, and it said at the end, he concluded his voice becoming more Welsh as he got drunker. And I wouldn't write that now because it's just too difficult.
No way, it's not going to be Welsh, no way. Your new book then, because that was published last week. And
yes, Lotto, Twinks and the Maharaja's Jewel. This is my Lotto and Twink series. They're my Marmite books that people either think they're hysterically funny or think, what is he on? What's he doing? They're about two aristocratic siblings in the 1920s. And I make up all the slang because and I just have a lot of fun with that. So, you know, common people are oikish sponge worms, for instance, and you know, people say a lot of sorry?
Definitely one for Tesco's.
Or lumps of toad spawn and stenchers. There are lots of stenchers around, spoffing stenchers. And so, I mean, they're deeply silly books, and I love them. And as I say, about half of the people who read them love them, and the others think, you know, he's past it. But yes, and in fact, the book I'm starting next week is another one of those, which is going to be Lotto, Twinks and the Suspicious Guests. So yeah, I mean, they're, as I say, they're very silly, but they amuse me.
Yeah,
I'm very lucky now. I think I can say I don't have to do any work that I don't enjoy, which has not always been the case, you know. So I mean, sometimes I hate it because it's going so badly, but it's you know, if I get it right, I will enjoy it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what are your top tips for people who want to be screenwriters? Because I know we've got some people who are screenwriters or aspiring screenwriters watching.
Screenwriting.
Yeah.
It sounds obvious to say think visually. Also, I think, you know, writing for television and film is, I mean, it's, I know John Brain said, oh, it's not writing, it's a committee activity. You're going to have a lot of input from other people. I think you have to acknowledge that. And it also is quite a technical medium, so you have to, you know, you have to find out how it works. So, I mean, there are books and things you can read that, I mean, the most effective books I think I've read about any sort of advice to writers, the two by William Goldman, one of which was Adventures in the Screen Trade, and the other, which is called Which Lie Did I Tell, which was a direct quotation from a producer he was working with. And I mean, those are about screenwriting, but they're actually very good about any kind of writing. The other thing, I mean, the real difficulty with screenwriting is getting the job, you know, because it's a kind of, you know, it's a bit of a catch-22 that in television and film, they want people who have experience of writing television and film. So how do you get the experience? And I suppose a lot of people do it through soaps and things like, you know, they write episodes for soaps, and then I mean, that's how Jimmy McGovern came up, and quite a lot of other writers. So as I say, getting the work is the most difficult bit there. But I mean, I think I've done a certain amount of it, and I don't think mine is a very visual mind. You know, mine is a very verbal mind. I mean, I can do it, but I don't find it as easy. And also, it's much more difficult to get because you've got all these technical things in your mind, I find it much more difficult to get a flow. You know, you have to write each scene separately, and then, and when you get to the end, you know, there's a great satisfaction in having got it right. But you'll then have a call from the script editor who will tell you you haven't got it right at all. In my experience, I mean, in my experience, the way you are treated as a writer is in inverse proportion to the budget, or indeed to how much you're paid. So, I mean, you know, if you're a screenwriter for Hollywood, you are paid a huge amount of money, but as a percentage of the overall budget of a movie, it's nothing. And, you know, they say in Hollywood, you can be introduced as the current writer on a project, which is a really dispiriting thing. And they also say in Hollywood, you know, there's the joke that goes around about the starlet who was so dumb she slept with the writer. But whereas, you know, and television again, you know, you are paid relatively a lot, but your script can be, you know, the number of people who have the right to ask for rewrites is unbelievable. When you get to radio, it's much simpler because many less people are involved. And writing books, I find, you know, is really get very little, well, relatively little sort of demands for rewrites and things. I think the writers are respected more in those areas.
Yeah, so yeah. So what would your top tips for somebody who's writing a new novel then?
Well, it depends what kind of novel they are writing. I think, you know, follow your instincts. I mean, think what, you know, what would I like to read is probably a very good starting point. Certainly not what is a current bestseller. I think that's hopeless, you know, to try to replicate something that is already there. Oh, I've gone all pale, haven't I?
I was going to say, you've got quite fun.
I've been taken over by aliens.
Yeah, very strange. Don't know, is it
Let's do the light.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. Anyway, I'm still here.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, writing a novel, I would say, I think a very good rule in any writing is if it's boring you, it's sure as hell going to be boring the reader.
Yes.
And this will often surprise you, because again, as I was saying, like the big chapter that becomes the small chapter, the big scene that you've been looking forward to writing, often, you know, you don't need as much as you thought. And so, you know, if it's boring you, move on, go on to the next thing.
Yeah, no, that's great.
And I mean, there's a whole area, you know, with research. I mean, try to get it right, but it's the story is much more important than getting the research right. And certainly researching something again which doesn't interest you will show. It's very strange, this. I don't know what's happened to me.
It's sunlight coming across the screen or something.
Am I? Oh, touch myself. When I say touch myself on the screen, I'll no. I don't know what's happening.
Are you up for some questions then? Because I think we've got quite a few questions.
Okay.
So,
yes. I'm just going to see if doing something to the light.
makes any difference. No, I'm.
If you've got any questions, Simon,
I've gone all misty.
at the bottom.
I am still here.
So that's fine. So I was just telling people to put their questions in the Q&A box so I can have a look. So now, Fiend in Singapore, because you know her from years back, she sent in a question already. So, and I have to point out that Simon's very, very popular within the society, and a lot of people we're very excited about him carry on today. Fiend being one of them. So, and she says, when your book was made into a film, were you asked to write the screenplay? How much were you involved in how the book was interpreted for the screen?
The answer to that is not at all to the second. I wasn't involved in the making of the movie at all. And what happened, this was a book called A Shock to the System, which was made into a movie starring Michael Caine. And when my only involvement in it was bending down to the doormat, picking up an envelope containing the largest check of my professional life. I wish it happened more often. And my wife and I built onto our kitchen a conservatory, which we still call the Michael Caine Annex.
I should have got him to come and open it with a ribbon.
We happened to be in, that's a bit better. We happened to be in New York when the movie opened. And by then we'd met the screenwriter, who's a lovely guy called Drew Claven. And he said to me, and when I heard that you didn't want to write the screenplay, I was delighted. And I was never asked whether I wanted to write the screenplay. So there you go. But it was quite funny because he had found out when they were doing a cruise showing of the thing, which is where everyone who's worked on the movie sees it in the cinema just before it opens to the general public. And we were sitting there, I with my wife beside me, rigid with fear because I didn't know what they'd done to my book, and Drew with his wife beside him, rigid with fear because he did know what they'd done to his screenplay. And my wife leant across and stroked my arm and said, "Simon, it's a very nice conservatory," which I think was extraordinarily healthy.
A priority.
So I had nothing to do with the movie at all. I didn't meet Michael Caine. I didn't, as I said, I just got this lovely check and very nice conservatory just down there.
You'll have to send us a photo. We'll put it in the magazine. So, Prunella says, do you still have a copy of the poem you wrote and read for our 100th anniversary? It was great. Apparently, did you write a poem?
I probably did.
Yeah.
If they say I did.
You better dig it out and send it to me. I need to have a read.
Was that at the? I remember.
Creamy.
It was the 100th anniversary, was it?
Yeah, apparently so. Maybe Pam can remind us where that was, because I wasn't around then.
I remember and I think that was a later one. I remember one of St. Bride's in the church.
Yeah.
That.
Perhaps Pam will drop us a line and tell us where it was. Have you had an agent since the start of your career?
I, as soon as I had interest in the first book, Gollancz wanted to publish it, I thought the history of writing is the history of writers being ripped off by publishers, so I need an agent. And I got in touch with the only person I knew who'd ever had a book published, who was a guy who worked at the BBC, where I then was, called Tony Aspler. And he put me in touch with his agent, who had just set up on his own, lovely guy called Michael Motley. And Michael was my agent for over 40 years.
Oh, wow.
I mean, many marriages don't last that long. And he retired, 2 or 3 years ago. And it was just a very happy relationship. We got on extremely well. And we still, he's now over 80, but I was talking to him last week. I still sent him a copy of each new book as I finish it. And he's always got some very shrewd little, the latest one, I had a guy who was a wine buff, having people to lunch, and I had him opening the second bottle of wine, you see, and my agent said, well, surely, you know, if you were a wine buff, you would have had it open already and breathing. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's things like that. He's great. So, I mean, that was a very happy relationship. And in fact, he's godfather to one of my sons, and I'm godfather to his daughter. And so we're still very much in touch. But when he decided to retire, as I say, about 4 years ago, I think, it's quite difficult to find a new agent because, I mean, as an agent, what you really want is, you know, to be developing your own new talents. And the sort of taking on someone who's written over 90 books, there's going to be a lot of sort of admin. So I found it quite difficult. But then, in fact, one of my editors, my publisher's editors, put me in touch with a lovely lady called Lisa Moylett, and that has worked a treat. I mean, she's considerably younger than me, and you know, that again is a very happy relationship. So I've been very fortunate in that respect. And I've also, I mean, I've got other agents who deal with television and that kind of thing. These are just purely literary agents, but yeah.
Well, that's you have different agents for the different things.
Yes, well, I mean, because I write, you know, it varies, but I've got someone else. I mean, for instance, things like options on the various series. I mean, at the moment, there are options for development in television on Charles Paris and the Feathering books and Mrs. Pargeter. Whether any of them will ever come to fruition, I don't know, because there have been lots of other options in the past which haven't. But so I have an agent who deals with that side of it. And I have another agent who deals with theatre stuff, because I do write occasional stage plays as well. So I'm very well buttressed by good agents.
Excellent, excellent. So KCB says, how long does it take you to write a book?
Oh, the answer to this is all my life, obviously, because, you know, the experience that goes into it. But having said that, I do tend to write them quite quickly. I mean, I wrote 3 last year, and I suppose the actual writing is about 3 months, I would say. So say 4 months for the whole experience. So yeah, I mean, the one that I'm starting on Monday, if I say this to enough people, I will, is due
on Monday now and check up on you.
is due at the end of April. So that should be all right, I think.
What's that? So it's 70,000
That
words?
is Blotto Twinks and the Suspicious Guests.
And the suspicious. But is it about 70,000 words, something like that?
No, it's less than that. It'll be nearer 60, I would say. Yeah. Yeah. Might even be less than that.
Roughly how many words do you get out a day then?
Well, it depends what I'm writing, but I'm now, I reckon 1,000 words a day is what I hope to do. But that, I mean, what happens is that, you know, I slip behind, and then I speed up amazingly towards the end. So, I mean, on, you know, the last book I finished, I mean, I reckon, as I say, you know, in the last 2 days, I did 10,000 words, which is 2 weeks, you know, what would normally take me 2 weeks, but because I was so caught up in it and there was no, you know, I was literally sort of, you know, like being yes, absolutely, totally manic. I knew I'd never sleep again until I finished it. So that's but so 2 or 3. But I mean, the actual writing is 2 or 3 months, and by the time, you know, the editor's seen this in the rewrites and that kind of thing, it's probably about 4 months, I would say.
Yeah, that's still quite quick.
Well, yes.
Did you write chapter 24 after the long think and then go back to 23, or wait until chapter 23 arrived before continuing past Mary?
The answer to that question is that I wrote chapter 23 after chapter 22, once I'd worked out how I could bridge between 22 and 24. And actually that's because I think particularly crime writing tends to be very linear. You know, you start at the beginning and you tell yourself the story and you work out. And the only writer I know who crime writer who didn't do that was P.D. James, who actually, you know, she'd think about, she started with setting, then she'd think about the whole story for 6 months, even a year. And then she said she shot it like a film. You know, she would write the scene that was most vivid to her, which might be the confrontation with the murder at the end, or it might be the discovery of the body. And so she actually wrote out a sequence. That's very unusual in a crime writer. I mean, she was clearly doing something right if you look at her sales, but most crime writers are very linear because there are a lot of little threads you're keeping in your mind, and you know, you think, yeah, I've got to tie up that bit, I've got to, you know. So I mean, I do go back and rewrite quite a lot as I'm going along, because, you know, for this to have happened, that must have happened there. So cool. Yeah. So I mean, my second draft, my final draft, probably takes about 3 days, you know, because I've done so much rewriting earlier.
That is really quick for a second draft.
Well, I mean, because I've been rewriting all the way, if you see what I mean. So yeah. It's only, and I always get to the same thing like 2 days before I finish. I think, oh God, this is going to be, I've got to rewrite the whole thing, pick it all apart. And then when I actually read it, it's not as bad as I feared. I mean, it's quite bad, but it's, you know, and that's another very strange thing, how you react to something when you've just finished it. Sometimes, you know, there's a very brief period where you think, actually, that's not bad, you know, you've done all right there. And then next week you think, oh, God. And also when you're doing the proofs and things, that again, I mean, sometimes you read a proof and you think, wow, oof, this is one of his best, you know, it really is. Another one, you think, oh, God, I've got to go through all this bloody rubbish. And it's very volatile, I think. I have
the experience when I see my business book in print, I don't think it looks like somebody else did it, and I look at it and think,
oh, that's rather nice, isn't it? I mean, it's very very grown up. You think, oh gosh, look at that. I mean, I'm quite surprised. I mean, I don't often look back on my early books, but actually the style hasn't really changed a great deal. You know, I can turn a page, well, I know what's coming on the next page, even if I haven't read it for 30 years or something, which is I don't know whether that's good or bad. I mean, you know, maybe I've settled down into a rhythm, or maybe I just peaked too early. But I'm a great believer in not peaking too early. I'm still waiting to peak. Yeah.
Absolutely, you are still waiting. Right. So Mary says, it's with some embarrassment that I admit I've never read any of your novels. Could you?
You're in the majority, dear. Yes.
Oh, I'm sure that's not true. Could you please suggest one to start with? By the way, I'm moving down to Bognor next month, and my son lives in Littlehampton, so I'll look out for you.
Oh, well, if you're going to do that, you should read one of the Feathering books, because they are set very near that. And in fact, it's in Bognor that I'm having my COVID jab on Wednesday. So there is, but no, one of the Feathering books, because Feathering is a little village I've invented, which is very near Bognor in Worthing. And so which of those would I recommend? The Killer in the Choir is a recent one. They all alliterate, so you could do the killer in the choir, or the stabbing in the stables, or the torso in the town, or the body on the beach, or bones under the beach hut, you know. But I would recommend the killing in the choir.
Right.
I hope you enjoy it.
Homework from this session. You go, oh, I've lost 3 of. Oh, it's disappeared. Everything's disappeared. Hang on. Oh, there it is. It's back again. This is the trouble with having computer screens everywhere. Things vanish. So, right, Janet says, if you were asked to write a play for radio that lasts 40 minutes, is there an easy way of working out how many pages that would be?
I mean, there are all kinds of things that will be recommended to you, but in my experience, the only accurate way of doing it is to read it out loud. You know, and also in doing that, you will hear a few clunky lines which, you know, you didn't that could be better phrased, and you know, if you say, oh, I don't know how fast the actors will do it, you'll be quite close if you just read it out and read out if there are sound effects and things, read those out too. And you'll not be far off, and that is definitely the best way to do it. And I was thinking, actually, in radio, there's Timothy West, the actor, wrote a wonderful radio play, a spoof radio play, which was called "This Gun That I Have in My Right Hand Is Loaded." And it has examples of really bad radio writing, and there's a lovely exchange with a husband and wife, and the husband says, "Would you like a drink, dear?" And the wife said, "Oh, yes, please." He said, "What would you like?" He said, "Oh, I'd like a whiskey." And he says, "Whiskey? My, that's a strong drink for an attractive 27-year-old red-haired girl like you," which is an example of how not to write for radio. I just pass that on.
It's really shocking. Well, those are all our questions. I'm just
Well, that's splendid.
Yeah, that's all brilliant. So, thank you so much.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and I hope that our paths will cross in real life at some point.
Yes,
you never
well,
know.
You're not going away from us again now. You're going to be back once we're up and running. You're going to have to come and see us, so we can have proper events again, which we
Ooh, be exciting. Well, the jab is first step. Let us hope. Yes.
Yeah, let's hope by the summertime it'll be good. So thank you so much for your time today. I mean,
well, it's been a great pleasure. And, you know, onward and upward with the SWWJ.
Absolutely.
It's great.
Yeah.
I must say I've appreciated the frequent bulletins. They've been, you know, been very good. The amount that's been achieved in adverse circumstances is very impressive.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you to say. So,
Okay.
and for anybody who's listening, we've actually got a workshop event on the 1st of March, which is with international body language expert Steph Holloway again, who's joining us all the way from New Zealand. And she's going to be talking about body language cues to include in your writing for specific behaviours. So, so if you want to show lying or relationship, you know, somebody likes somebody else in a relationship sort of way, then she'll show you how to show that in your writing. So, and she's also producing some worksheets for us as writers as well, which will be really helpful. So come along to that on the 1st of March. Anyway, thanks so much, Simon, and thanks everyone for joining today.
I will slip into the ether, but nice to see you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.